Hi, my name is Ava Weitzman, and I'll be presenting today on behalf of myself and my co-authors Curtis Child and Chris Sylvia. We're from Brigham Young University, and our paper today is entitled Hansmann's Contract Failure Theory, Correct but Irrelevant? Our main question is whether or not Hansmann's contract failure theory is still relevant given changes that have happened since he was writing in 1980. In 1980, he identified a problem in which consumers were in a poor position to judge the services they were receiving. And he proposed that one of the purposes of nonprofit enterprise, especially as regulated by government, was to provide a remedy to this, because the government would sort of serve as a third-party certifier that would allow people to have greater trust in the services that they were receiving, especially those that they were providing charitable donations to. Since Hansmann was writing in 1980, there have been some important potential shifts. One of those is the presence of certification and labeling regimes that are handled by third-party observers. And this is where you have third-party actors who identify a list of requirements that organizations need to meet in order to receive a certification label. So obviously that fills a very similar role to the list of legal obligations that are laid out by government in providing a nonprofit certification. So there's a possibility that there's a trade-off between those two roles, and that third-party certification might actually supplant the need for nonprofit certification. On the other hand, there's also sort of the ubiquitous availability of ratings, ranking, and review information available on the internet. And given that you can actually have people identifying what the effects are of products and services, even if donors aren't themselves the consumers, that may render unnecessary the presence of nonprofit labels. So, does sector still matter to consumers given these recent developments that solve some of the contract failure problems that originally made nonprofit enterprise attractive? In order to answer this question, we use a choice-based conjoint analysis procedure. So we hired through Sentiment a panel of over 1,300 respondents, and we randomly assigned these respondents to one of several different scenarios. So what you see in front of you here is an example of the kind of activity that we had our respondents participate in. So they would receive a prompt like the one you see here. Each column below describes an organization that makes and delivers healthy food to low-income families, and that part was part of the condition that we randomized on, so we had several different scenarios, and I'll go through what those were in a moment. Then we talk about the mission of the organizations and sort of level the playing field and identify that all of the missions are the same. So the mission in this case is to ensure that all families have healthy options for meals. Then comes the task. If you wanted to purchase a meal for a low-income family and these were your only options, which would you choose? And so each of our respondents would then identify which of the four organizations they would prefer to provide the service that we outlined. And you'll notice the little 1 of 14 in the top left corner here. Each of our respondents participated in 14 of these scenarios, always with the same mission and same type of organization product, but in each case rotating through a different 4 organizations with different characteristics. So we varied these on 4 variables within each of the 4 scenarios. So the 4 scenario conditions were fair labor shirts. So these are t-shirts that are created using fair trade labor. Meals for people in need, which is the scenario that we just saw. Health tests, where the respondent is supposed to choose an organization that would provide health test information for themselves as the consumer. And finally, museum admission. And so we chose those to provide sort of a range of potentially charitable or non-charitable options. So in one of those scenarios, they're providing something for someone else, which is a classic contract failure setting. Museum admission, adds sort of a charitable element where you're still benefiting from the admission, but there's a charitable element to that cause. A lot of museums run as nonprofits, but they also run in a variety of other formats. And then health tests have a slightly more sort of commercial bent, but still has that medical element where we do see, you know, for example, some nonprofit health organizations and some for-profit health organizations, even some public health organizations. And then of course the fair labor t-shirts would be the most capitalistic or market-based of all of these options. So each scenario condition, each respondent received only one scenario condition. So they're not flipping back and forth between scenario conditions. They always have the same scenario for all 14 exercises. But what does vary is the organization type, the cost, the star ratings, and whether or not there's a certification label. So those range from nonprofit, for-profit, and government agency to an unknown organization type. Within cost, it ranges from $10 to $15. For star ratings, it ranges from 1 star to 5 star with a 6th option of no rating information available. And certification is either present or non-present in each of these scenarios. So we're going to describe our results using these graphs, and we're going to go through a series of these for each of the different scenarios. So on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see which scenario we're dealing with. And for some of the scenarios, we have a 3-sector situation. So that's for-profit, nonprofit, and no information available. And in those cases where there was a plausible third type of actor, government actor, we have a 4-sector scenario. So for museums and health tests, you'll see a 4-sector scenario that's there. To orient us a little bit to what's happening in the actual graphic, the first thing that we need to know is that what we're looking here on the y-axis is the probability of being selected. So the higher probability means that that type of organization combination is more likely to be chosen. And that's our key outcome that we're looking at here is are these organizations likely to be chosen or preferred by our consumer respondents? So then we need to kind of walk through what happens with each of these variables. So the first variable we're going to look at is the star ratings. And you can see that each column here indicates those star ratings. And the main takeaway from this is that in general, as star ratings increase, so does the probability of being selected. So consumer ratings have a very strong positive effect on probability. And in fact, you can see across all scenarios that this holds true, and that the largest leap from the bottom of the probability box to the top of the probability box is always due to the number of star ratings from these consumer ratings. So that has a very strong positive effect. The next variable that we want to look at is the cost effect. And so the x-axis within each of these boxes graphs the effect of price. And we can see that increases in price always have a negative effect on the probability of being selected. So the more expensive something is at the margin, the less likely that organization is to be chosen, or that product is to be purchased from that particular organization. And that again is a consistent finding throughout all of the scenarios. The third variable, of course, is whether or not there is a certification label affiliated with the organization. And what we see here is that certification does have a positive effect on probability, but it's not a super huge effect. So if you look at kind of within the boxes where everything else is being held constant, there is a positive shift for certification, but it's usually not like an astronomical shift. So it matters, but it doesn't necessarily matter a ton. So the last thing that we're going to talk about is the variable that we actually care about, and that does vary across these scenarios in some interesting ways. So we're looking at whether the organization is a nonprofit, for-profit, government entity, or whether the organizational type is unknown. And so what we're looking for is the color of the dots within each of the boxes, and the blue dots indicate nonprofit status, and that's really the one that we want to focus on here. So you'll notice that in this particular scenario, it's very pronounced. You can see that there's a distance or a difference in probability of being selected that's based on the color of the dot or the organizational type. And in this case, where we're looking at purchasing meals for families in need, we can see that there's a significant and positive effect across all scenarios for nonprofit status. So that within this scenario is a very consistent finding that for our most charitable scenario, nonprofit status has a significant positive persistent effect. What's interesting though is once we switch to the other scenarios, so the next scenario is purchasing a fairly traded t-shirt, the effect of nonprofitness seems to actually change and interact with the other variables. So what we see here is that nonprofit status and certification actually behave as though they're substitutes, especially on that high level. So we have high star ratings. So consumer reports suggest high quality for these t-shirts. And if there's certification present, then it doesn't matter so much whether you have nonprofit status or not, unless it's a really expensive t-shirt. And then we start to care whether or not there's a nonprofit status associated with it. But if there's no certification available, all of a sudden nonprofit status appears to really matter. And it matters in this case once you hit the 2-star level. And so that is different from what we saw in the more charitable scenario. But this type of pattern gets even more pronounced as we move on to other types of scenarios. So here's the purchasing a health test scenario. And what we see here is that nonprofit status actually amplifies certification in low rating scenarios and replaces it in high rating scenarios. In other words, if we have really poor ratings and no certification, there's a low probability that these things are going to be bought regardless of what type of organization is providing that product or service. But in the presence of certification, so we have another quality signal here. So we have low consumer ratings, but it's certified. Now it's almost as though nonprofit status provides additional corroboration that this is a high quality product, and we can see a higher probability for certified company or organizations, even if they're on the low end of consumer satisfaction. On the high end, though, we see exactly the opposite pattern. So here, if you have certification and 5 stars, it no longer matters whether you're a nonprofit organization or not, because we have 2 sources of evidence that this is a high quality product or service, and so nonprofit status doesn't appear to matter. But if we have no certification and we only have the consumer ratings of 5 stars, again, nonprofit status appears to really matter in differentiating at that point. What's interesting about this pattern is that it persists not only in the 3-sector health test scenario, but also in the 4-sector health test scenario, and also in the 4-sector museum ticket scenario. So we see this same pattern in all of those other scenarios. So what we conclude from that, in answer to our question, does sector matter to consumers, given recent developments that solve some of the contract failure problems that make nonprofit enterprise attractive? We find that yes, sector still matters to consumers, especially in some settings, specifically charitable settings, but that in no circumstances does sector matter to consumers as much as consumer ratings.